Joining me is Basima Al-Hussein. She is the CEO of Al-Hussein Global Strategies, an international government affairs consulting firm. And joining us also is Ryan Mauro, a security analyst with the Clarion Project. Thank you both for being with us. So Ryan, let's start with you. So we've got Saudi Arabia's public prosecutor concluding that an intelligence officer ordered Khashoggi's murder, not the Crown Prince. The audio tapes in no way implicate the Crown Prince. Action has been taken against those responsible by the Saudis and by the U.S. Ryan, is this episode over now?
No, it's definitely not, because the dictator of Turkey, Erdogan, is trying to make the most of it. And in one of the most underreported developments I've seen in recent years, he actually brought in Muslim Brotherhood figures, including the spiritual leader, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, into Turkey for a big event at which Qaradawi basically preached that Turkey should be the new caliphate, should lead the global jihad, and in regards to Saudi Arabia, basically made the case that the Saudi government is guilty of contributing to the war on Islam and being apostates, which is essentially saying, go wage jihad against them. It was just short of a declaration of war. It's just Erdogan didn't want to do it himself, so he brought in Muslim Brotherhood leaders into Turkey so that they could do it for him.
Interesting point. Let's focus on that angle for a minute. Basima, to Ryan's point, it is Turkey that seems to have benefited from this whole saga, that very conspicuous, some calling it almost too conspicuous, murder on Turkish soil. What do you make of that?
Well, I think President Erdogan has definitely proven himself to be somewhat of an opportunistic genius. There are two main takeaways from the event. The first is that Turkish intelligence is incredibly impressive, and the second is that the Saudi crisis communications team most likely needs to be replaced. They haven't done a very good job of handling the issue up until this point, and we see widespread lack of credibility and mistrust among the international community towards the Saudi Arabian government.
Ryan, let's talk about the response then. Is this enough in terms of what we've seen from the U.S.? Because the tapes do not implicate the Crown Prince. They've maintained it's a rogue operation. There doesn't seem to be any evidence to contradict that point of view. So do we leave it at that, or does the U.S. need to take further action that could potentially jeopardize U.S.-Saudi relationship and jeopardize an entire Middle East agenda?
The U.S. does have to be, just out of moral obligation, say more and criticize the Saudis and basically say whether these are rogue intelligence officers or not, and I don't believe that they were rogue, it's still the responsibility of the Saudi government. You don't want to just parrot their line, and so you criticize them. Maybe there's some minor sanctions, but you compare that with, perhaps in private, arrangements for further cooperation with the Saudis, particularly against the Muslim Brotherhood, because what was the reason for this assassination? It's because from the Saudi perspective, he was a Muslim Brotherhood operative, an enemy combatant. We know he was supportive of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so that's the primary concern of the Saudis. They may have also wanted to send a message to Turkey because of this type of proxy war that's going on. But the United States, for every single time it criticizes the Saudis, it should also criticize the government of Turkey and do so louder because, frankly, they are the bigger threat right now. And we don't want this spiraling out of control. And it will if the Turks feel emboldened.
Well, there certainly are a number of double standards and hypocrisies in this whole situation that have come to light. Ryan and Basima, don't go anywhere. We'll continue this conversation after the break. And we are discussing the latest developments regarding the death of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia's public prosecutor has concluded that an intelligence officer ordered his murder, not the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman. The U.S. Treasury Department has imposed economic sanctions on 17 Saudi officials who it said had, quote, targeted and brutally killed Khashoggi. We're joined by Basima Al-Hussein and Ryan Mauro to break all of this down. Basima, before the break, you were discussing the Turkish intelligence, commenting on the fact that this whole situation, if nothing else, proved that they're highly competent. But let's talk about these tapes, this evidence that they have now shared with other intelligence officers from around the world, but have not actually given them the tapes for independent analysis. There's still a lot of unanswered questions there, Basima, like how they got these tapes, who recorded them, why were they recorded in the first place, and what took the Turkish authorities so long to share this intel with other intelligence operations around the world. What do you think of that aspect here?
I think that there are some very clear answers to that. The first answer that I'd like to present to the audience is that the Central Intelligence Agency has already determined that a crime at this high of a level, it's highly unlikely that Mohammed bin Salman wouldn't be aware of it and give the sign-off authority. So even though we don't have conclusive evidence on those tapes, I believe the direct quote was, "Tell your boss the deed is done." And so there's a lack of clarity about who the boss is, who's being referred to on the tape. But it's understood that Mohammed bin Salman most likely, in general, would be the person who would give this kind of order.
How did it come that this whole thing was being recorded in the first place? Does that not seem suspicious?
Well, the embassy, no, it's not at all. The embassy was clearly bugged by Turkish intelligence,
and that's okay?
A fairly standard. Well, it's not necessarily okay, but it's a fairly standard practice. It's certainly one that the U.S. engages in as well. And we would there's clear motives for why the Turks would closely bug the Saudi embassy, particularly well as opposed to other embassies, because exactly as Ryan pointed out, they're hoping to use this as an opportunity to position Turkey as the leader of the Islamic world over Saudi Arabia. So I think that also touches on the other question you raised, which was why the timing of how the Turks have released this information. And I have to say that the Turkish communications team and the communications team of President Erdogan have probably handled this extremely well, in that what they've done is they've done deliberate leaks, and then each time they've allowed the Saudis to somewhat tie their own noose. So rather than revealing all of the details at once, they've just put out a specific leak and then let the Saudis come up with some kind of fabricated story to respond to that specific leak, being unaware of other information that would come out later that would disprove it. So we've seen about 5 or 6 different stories now that the Saudis have presented in response to Turkish information. And so that's just a very strategic communications game.
Well, Ryan, maybe the fact that the Saudis didn't get their story straight is because they didn't know what the story was. I mean, there are obviously critics that say that it's highly unlikely that the Crown Prince would not have been aware of this operation. But there are many that say that this could have been a rogue operation, that there are many in the Saudi establishment that had links to Khashoggi, that had an axe to grind with the Crown Prince. His reforms, his corruption crackdown, he's made a lot of enemies with that. I mean, take anyone locked up in the Ritz-Carlton, for example. And Ryan, there's certainly many parties that would benefit from creating discord between the Crown Prince and the Trump administration. And there's an argument that this operation could have been arranged by someone in the Saudi establishment to frame the Crown Prince. Seems like so far nothing in this tape disqualifies that theory. What do you make of it?
Well, if you wanted to frame the Crown Prince, you would have said things that you knew were going to be recorded. I mean, they had to know that the Turks were going to be bugging that consulate. That just would have been common sense. So if they wanted to frame the Crown Prince, they would have said more damning things in the recordings and done various other things. The operatives engaged in the murder clearly thought that they would be safe coming home. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gone home. So at the very least, if there wasn't direct approval for the actual murder and it was only for capturing him, they thought it was okay to do this and go back home and there'd be no problem. And that had to come from the highest levels. But I would reiterate the point on just how impressive the Turks, not necessarily their intelligence operation was around this, but their outreach to the media. It was amazing how over like a 48-hour period, every newspaper had some exclusive story citing anonymous Turkish officials. That's clearly coordinated. That doesn't just happen by accident and through the normal reporting process.
Speaking of Turkey, Bassem, I quickly want to get your reaction on this. Apparently, Turkey rejected a deal from the White House to expel Fethullah Gulen. As we know, Erdogan holds him responsible for that coup attempt against him in exchange for taking it easy in this investigation. The Turks saying that they rejected this reported deal. What do you make of this?
I think that President Erdogan is being extremely strategic when it comes to this development in events, and understands that he certainly needs to gain the support and of the public opinion, and that this is a way to do it, not only in Turkey, but in the Islamic world writ large.
Right. So I guess you don't buy the story that there was a deal with Fethullah Gulen to be exchanged.
No.
All right. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Basima El Hussein and Ryan Mauro. Appreciate your perspectives and analysis. Thanks for being with us.